This week on Just Solutions. With the midterm elections upon us, voting rights advocates around the country are paying attention to our election systems, the very structures that hold up our democracy. This comes at a time that numerous states around the country have passed laws restricting access to the ballot. Our guest today is Robert Brandon, President and CEO of the Fair Elections Centre. They use litigation and advocacy to remove barriers to registration and voting, particularly those disenfranchising underrepresented and marginalised communities. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Bob, it's great to have you with us. Thanks for being our guest today.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
Well, a large part of your work is having election officials be held to account to explain why certain groups of voters are treated differently than others. So what is happening right now around the country? And we'll dig into specific states that are exceptionally problematic. But as you see it right now, are all groups of voters treated equally right now in the US?
Well, no. And I just want to distinguish between election officials, the people that run the elections, and legislators who are passing many of these laws that are really designed to narrow options for many people in the voting community. We spend our time battling against those voter suppression efforts, either in the courts or in the legislatures. And a good deal of our work is also about educating people about how to navigate the rules that do exist to make sure that they can cast a ballot and it'll be counted.
Well, I know that, as you said, you use advocacy and you also use the courts and litigation as well. And you're investigating many times under the radar violations of the right to vote. Give us some examples of that. We know that many states have passed legislation that are restricting access to the ballot, but what is playing out and what is maybe under the radar not getting as much attention as some other aspects of all of this?
Well, I think first let's remember that in 2020 we saw the largest turnout in history for an election in the middle of a pandemic. And I think unfortunately in response to that, there have been a number of state legislatures who have decided that they really do better when less people vote. So we've seen a lot of passing of legislation. Some of it would narrow the options for voting. For example, cutting back on the amount of time people could vote early, cutting back or making it harder to vote by mail, maybe limiting the number of additional drop boxes or polling places, things like that, which just put more barriers in the way of a voter. And so we see those things. There's always discussion with the people that pass these laws to say, well, come on now, look at the turnout last time. It was great. So obviously this doesn't have an impact, but that's not the actual situation. We know that many people wind up, because of some of these changes and some of these laws, not being able to cast a ballot. And, we are trying to make sure that as many people as possible understand what the rules are, even if they're made more complicated, but can in fact overcome them. I do think that's what we're seeing now. There's a confluence here. You've got a number of pieces of legislation, a number of laws that have been put on the books since 2020 and many before that are specifically designed to make it harder to vote. But when those laws get passed, it also motivates a lot of people to go out and vote. So you see both things happening at the same time. And we're trying to make sure that, in fact, people understand that the most important thing in our democracy is to make your voice heard at the ballot box, and that more and more people are going to turn out. We're beginning to see just now, during the early vote period, historic increases in early voting in person compared, for example, to the last midterm. So we'll see what happens. We don't know in the end until after the election.
Well, you mentioned there some of the laws that we have seen passed in state legislatures that are trying to limit who can actually cast a vote. And there's such a mishmash of votes and then challenges to this. So a mishmash of legislation, challenges to that. And it does seem to serve the purpose of confusing the electorate, and the fact then that many people are just so confused that they're further alienated from the process. And I think an example of that is what's happened in Florida, where you're having people being investigated by this so-called special task force who have lost the right to vote because of felonies that they have and time served in prison. And yet a real confusion now as to, well, who can vote, who can't vote. And talk about the chilling effect then when you have situations like that, that this also serves the purpose of just discouraging people from showing up and casting a vote in the first place.
Well, the situation in Florida, and we filed a lawsuit and challenged the rule that was in place before. In 2018, the voters of Florida passed a law, an initiative that gave people who had felony convictions the right to vote after they completed their sentence. And the legislature jumped in and tried to undo some of that by saying, well, we think completing a sentence includes not only paying a fine, well, that is kind of like a sentence, but pay your court costs as well. Now, people have court costs whether they're a felon or not. And the biggest problem in Florida was most records of court costs were not achievable in terms of finding them again. So people who had to go pay their court costs went to the county to find out what they were, and they couldn't find out because there was no good record keeping. These are some of the people that the current governor is trying to go after to make examples of. These are people that have done their time. Many of them were caught up in some of the excessive drug laws back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, had felonies for possession of drugs, for example. And now they want to go vote. And because that court cost is still indeterminate and they didn't pay it, they're being charged with, in effect, another felony. And yes, it'll have some chilling effect. We hope, there are many great organizations in Florida that are working with former felons to get them to find out what they actually owe and help them pay the cost if it's excessive. But that's just an example, and that's very explicit. There are many other more implicit examples and some explicit where, for example, Montana last year eliminated the use of student IDs for voting, something they had on the books for 20 plus years. They did away with same-day registration, something they had on the books for 30 years. And it's pretty, explicit that those were aimed at certain people that the current legislators don't want voting.
What are some of your biggest concerns now for the midterm elections, given what's happened in different states passing these laws, given, as we said, a lot of the various different mix of different laws is seeking to also sow the seeds of chaos in the minds of many voters? What are you concerned about now for the midterms?
Well, and you're right, confusion is a big issue, and it comes about for two reasons. One, these laws keep on changing, and two, there are times when the laws are passed and then they're blocked by the courts, and then maybe they're unblocked by an appeals court. So it's a moving target. In many of these cases, at some point before the election, the courts don't want to get involved in making decisions because it's too close to an election. And that works both ways. There have been some examples this year where the Supreme Court refused to weigh in 8 months before the election to block what seems like a pretty bad law in Alabama. But in other cases, they've been willing to make changes recently as a few months ago or a month ago. So it does vary from place to place, and that confusion is a problem. It's one reason why our organization not only does this work on advocacy and litigation, but we spend a lot of time educating voters about what they need to know to register and vote. If you went to our website, we have voting guides for all 50 states. We have student voting guides. We do a great deal of work with college students and other young voters to make sure that they understand how they can navigate the rules to make sure their voice is heard in our democracy.
I'd like to talk about your work with students. You have this Campus Vote project. You mentioned there what happened in Montana, where the student ID was no longer being accepted, for showing up to vote. I know we've heard in North Carolina, as they're battling gerrymandering, that you had an HBSCU that was divided almost into two separate districts, a part of the effort to dilute the power of the Black vote. And so students are battling issues around voting in many different states and in many different ways. What are you hearing from students in campuses? What are some of the issues they're facing, and what is some of the work that you're doing?
Right. Well, our Campus Vote project works in partners with college administrators and faculty to help them get the basic information to their students. Our view is, if you're an institution of higher education or you're a professor on campus, one of your obligations is to make sure that your students understand how they can be a full voice and a full participant in our democracy. And we have partnerships with over 300 colleges and universities around the country. They enroll over 4 million students. We really focus on community colleges as well, where traditional political activity is not focused as much. Community colleges enroll about 42% of all the undergrads in the country right now. And we also work with a lot of minority serving institutions like the HBCUs, the historically Black colleges and universities you mentioned, to really make sure that students know what their rights are, know what the rules are. Keep in mind, many of them are away from home. They may be first-time voters, and they have choices. They can vote in their new community based on a Supreme Court decision almost 50 years ago, and they can vote back home where they come from. So we help them make sure that they know what the rules are and get involved, and we really want them to vote. We do a great deal we hire students on campuses to work with other students to have activities to make sure that students recognize they're not voting alone, they're voting with their peers, and their voices can be heard and can make a difference.
It seems interesting to me when I hear of voting rights advocates and rights groups like yourselves working with young people, that you're also setting good habits for the future. Because if you can get people engaged as voters right from their first eligibility to vote, you could be setting lifelong habits in place. Talk a little bit about the need to really engage with young voters to set those lifelong habits in place, but also they're tremendous influencers in their families, in their communities, and their peer groups.
Right. And I think it's one reason why we really like working with community college students, because they are in the community. We work with a lot of schools that have large numbers of students that come from immigrant communities and immigrant families, where they may not have been voting. They may not have had a tradition of voting in the various countries they come from. And these students, if you get them involved, they also can educate their parents and their siblings and their community friends and neighbors, but also just in general, making sure that young people understand the role they can play. This generation is the largest voting bloc now, the youth generation, and we really want to make sure that they make their mark. And it's important not only to make sure they understand what's on the ballot, who's running, but also how to vote, how to register, what are the deadlines. We have a lot of schools that will actually provide the professors in class and the vice president for student affairs, for example, with basic information they send out all the time through text and emails to the students, reminding them when there are deadlines, reminding them where the polling places are, either on campus or nearby. And those are very important. That basic information is probably the number one reason whether or not a young person will vote or not vote. If they don't have the information, it's the number one reason cited for them not to have voted.
Well, we'd love to hear from our viewers. Let us know your thoughts on this. Maybe you're in one of these states that has passed laws that are restricting the right to vote, or maybe you're in another state that's seeking to expand those laws. Let us know your thoughts on this issue. We'd love for you to join the conversation, drop us a comment, and engage with us on social media. Well, Bob, as we are heading into election day, albeit it's really now election season when you think of how many states have early voting, but we still have this one day that we're still calling election day. And a real integral part of that are the folks who are in the polling stations, the people who are the nuts and bolts of the elections, and those are poll workers. And I know the issue of poll workers is something that your organization is also working on. And we're hearing from election officials around the country that there are difficulties now in recruiting poll workers, most likely because of the chaos and the violence really that ensued for many of those poll workers in the 2020 election, intimidation of poll workers, and people really concerned around safety issues, but also because of the general chaos that we have talked about. That chaos can often disenfranchise voters, but also those folks who maybe in the past have turned out as poll workers, as election judges. Talk a little bit about your work around poll workers and your concerns in this particular area.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. So first of all, we have been involved in recruiting poll workers since 2016. We created a web portal called Work Elections that we've used for a number of years now. And in 2020, when we knew because of the pandemic, many of the traditional poll workers who were older were not going to work the polls because of their concern about the virus, we needed a whole new generation of poll workers to step up. And we and other organizations started something called Power the Polls, which is based on the information and data that we've collected for every jurisdiction in the country about what it takes to be a poll worker and how you can apply. And people can still go, and it's very late now, but there's a few more places probably around the country that still need poll workers. You could go to powerthepolls.org and see if they still need poll workers. But I would say this. I think of poll workers and the elections officials that run the elections as our real heroes. And they did an enormously important job in 2020. People stepped up and took the place of some of the older poll workers that were concerned about their health, and appropriately so. And this year, we and Power the Polls have recruited another about 150,000 additional people, in addition to about 200,000 that have remained in contact with us about wanting to be poll workers this year. I will say this, and yes, there have been threats made. Yes, there's been some reported efforts by some right-wing groups to recruit people who don't believe in elections to try to become poll workers. But in the end, poll workers are chosen by the people running the elections locally. And I don't think we're going to find a lot of people that are, in design wanting to sort of create chaos and do violence in the polls. And there are lots of guardrails. Number one, you don't get chosen just because you want to sign up to be a poll worker. You get vetted a bit and you get trained. Number two, poll workers can only do a certain number of things. They can't intimidate anybody. They can't ask them for an ID if that's not the law. They can't make a phone call as if they're trying to call somebody outside to say something about a voter. So they're limited in what they can do. And then even poll watchers, people that are usually assigned by the candidates and usually by one party and the other together, they're also limited in what they can do inside a polling place. So we want to assure everybody that they should go vote. If they haven't voted yet, they should go vote in person if they're more comfortable doing that, and that there are strength in numbers. And I think we're going to see a record turnout. And I think we're going to see, by and large, people making sure that voting is still safe and it's accessible. And that's the goal of all the work that we've done.
What are you hearing from those who administer our elections, those election officials, about the impact of what happened in 2020 and the ongoing lies being told about that election? Is that having an impact on their ability to recruit poll workers for the terms?
Well, I think there's always been a bit of a difficulty in some areas of the country to get poll workers. But as you mentioned early on, once somebody does that work, it's really quite, it's a lot of fun. You say, wow, I just helped all my friends and neighbors, or I helped my neighbors vote. This is really kind of cool. And a lot of them sign up to do it again. And that's why we've really focused on recruiting young people to be poll workers, because they think We think that it'll both help them become lifelong advocates for democracy and voting, but also, frankly, young people have more technology skills, and in elections are becoming more and more technologically complicated, and many of them are bilingual. And there are many places in the country where it's important to have bilingual speakers because there are a number of voters who are not, English is not their first language.
We've been talking about the fact that there are certain groups that are disenfranchised from the voting process, and this is really by design. We've talked about those laws that are being enforced, but tend to target voters of color, particularly large blocks of voters. But what are some of the other groups that you're concerned about that maybe don't get as much attention? I mean, I've heard from many disability rights advocates that attacks on early voting can really impact those with disabilities who have a much harder time potentially getting to the polls. That's why mail-in voting can be such a resource for those folks, seniors as well, who maybe have transportation issues. Talk about some of the other groups that are impacted by some of these laws that maybe don't get as much attention.
Yeah, and I mentioned students, of course, and young people generally, but disabled individuals. So, for example, in Florida and Arizona, laws have been passed to limit who can help somebody who needs help casting their ballot to immediate family members in the case of Arizona. And in the case of Florida, a person can only help 3 unrelated people during an election cycle. So we've represented, we represented, and the court, the case has been withdrawn and it's going to be filed again, Paralyzed Veterans of America, some of whom are in institutional settings, and they have social workers that work with them. And for years, the social workers help everybody in the institution to fill out their ballot and, more importantly, to deliver it. Under the Florida law, that would be illegal. They could only help 3 people in the institution. If they helped a 4th person, they'd be violating the law. In Arizona, you had to have been an immediate family member or a full-time care or a caregiver. We are probably going to challenge that law as well. But that's one example. I read recently that in Alabama, they've upheld some local officials' right to not have curbside voting, even though obviously for a lot of people who are disabled and don't have accessible polling places to go to, they pull up in their car and they get to vote. So that the disabled community, we also, another community that we work with is the Native American community, and they, many of them are living on reservations. They have vast distances to go in order to vote. Transportation is not great, and there was real resistance in places like Nevada and Arizona about putting polling places closer to where some of those reservation-based Native Americans live. And that's a constant struggle. The Native tribes have done a really good job of doing education and outreach. But for example, in before 2020 in South Dakota, the legislature passed a law that said you had to have a specific street address on your registration form. Now, many reservation-based Native Americans in South Dakota live on these rural expanses of roads that don't have actual street addresses. And that was explicitly targeting those voters to make sure they couldn't vote. That was actually struck down by the courts. But it's another example where there's just a real effort to try to figure out how to make additional barriers put in place for voting blocks that a particular legislature doesn't want to vote.
Well, we just have a few minutes left, Robert, but I do think it's worth touching on the fact that all of this patchwork quilt effect, really, of all these different voting laws in different states really underpins the need to have comprehensive federal protection. So where are we at with that? Albeit we might be in a different place after the midterm elections.
Right. Well, obviously, there was a real effort with the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the act drafted before that to get federal standards, federal minimum standards to allow everybody have much more accessibility to vote and not get caught up in some of these explicit voter suppression efforts at the state level. It'll depend very much on who controls the the House and the Senate after the election to see whether or not there'll be another opportunity to pass some federal protections. And at the same time, we've watched this Supreme Court and the one, in the last few years, chip away at the most important voting legislation in our history, which is the Voting Rights Act. And they're potentially, they've done it again this year with a case in Arizona, and they're looking at a couple of other opportunities to undermine, what has been the most important part of the voting history of this country, which has never been great. But the Voting Rights Act of 1965 made a huge difference in expanding access to voting across the board.
Just as we finish up then, Bob, for people who are watching and listening right now, maybe they're in a state that they're not impacted by this, that they feel pretty confident in their own access to the ballot. This is maybe news to them, the fact that young people, people with disabilities, disabled veterans are having these issues. For people who are concerned about this, what can they do either in this election or to set the stage for future elections and ensure equal access to the ballot for everybody who is eligible to vote?
Well, the first thing is to go out and vote this time and vote for people that are pro-democracy. Figure out who's on what side of what issues. But the most important thing is to vote. If we have record turnouts, that's good. No matter who, from my perspective, no matter who's out there voting, the more people that vote, the better. The healthier it will be our democracy. And then also make sure you tell other people to go vote. And if you've got, if you live in one state and you have good friends in another, or you've got family members, encourage them to vote as well. And then keep an eye on the various kinds of legislation, either in your state or in other states where you know people, and get involved. I mean, this is the core of our democracy. If we don't have the right to vote, we have no democracy.
As you mentioned at your website, you have a voting guide, which gives information for each state about how to register to vote. But also, I'm assuming it has information about maybe some restrictions. I mean, we talked about the fact that there's an effort to further block people from, voting. People, as we said, in Florida, despite the voters themselves saying we want people who have served time in prison to be able to vote, there's now efforts to undermine all of that. So for people who have questions about all of that, Fair Election Centre, I know your website has information on that, but what should people think about if they are maybe in a demographic that in some states have been targeted for diminished voting rights, but maybe they're unsure of what's happening in their own particular state? How can people find out?
Again, make sure you go out and vote. You can, look about the various ways to do it on our website. We have for all 50 states, we have voting guides. fairelectioncenter.org. And when you're out voting and you run into trouble, you can call the Election Protection Hotline. It's 1-800-OUR-VOTE. And if you look them up, if you happen to know people that are English or less English proficient and they need, the hotlines are also in Spanish and Arabic and a number of Asian languages as well.
Well, Bob Brandon, who is the president of the Fair Election Centre, thank you so much for being our guest on Just Solutions.
You're welcome. Happy to have been here.
And don't forget that Just Solutions is also available as a podcast. So subscribe to it wherever you get your podcasts and never miss an episode. And join us at same time, same place next week for another conversation from Free Speech TV's Just Solutions. Okay, we did it. This week on Just Solutions. In his new book, How We Win the Civil War, Securing a Multiracial Democracy and Ending White Supremacy for Good, best-selling author Steve Phillips charts the way forward for progressives and people of colour. After 4 years of Trump, he argues that Democrats must recognise the nature of the fight that we're in, which is a contest between democracy and white supremacy, left unresolved after the Civil War. Steve Phillips is the founder of Democracy in Colour and host of the podcast of the same name. In his new book, he argues that the time has come to finish the conquest of the Confederacy and all that it represents. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions.